Hey y'all, back in the garage working on the Aston Martin. So in the last video, I kind of took a look under the car, showed how it was set up, showed the accessory drive and some of the other things. And then I prepped some of the plumbing before the engine actually went in the chassis, just because a lot of the engine side of that plumbing is a lot easier to hook up. So now that it's here in the engine bay, I think some of the things that were set up will make a little more sense. So we'll kind of do a little tour of where everything's located and the plumbing that's been completed so far. So if we look this way and down, right down here is the heater hoses, and those run back. So this rear part here, this is the factory Aston setup. It's a little bit out of focus. There we go. So those hard lines are factory Aston setups, and then there's a quick connect right back there where it goes back to the firewall, and that sits right behind the cylinder head. It's pretty tight space. The AC line, hard lines out of the firewall are back there, and then those heater hoses, and then the engine harness kind of all fight for space back there. But it fits good enough. And then if we look down below the heater hoses, you'll see wrapped in fabric right down there. That is the engine harness, and it runs right back. That's the factory fuse box back there. It runs back there and then runs down into the fender, and the ECU will go in the stock spot. This right here, this little double bracket is for the breathers. That is a radium breathing air oil separator setup. It'll go in. As I mentioned before, right here is where the AC compressor would have been. It did hit the strut tower, so that wasn't viable. You can see the AN lines for the radiator run up to there. Looking down at the top of the radiator stack, we can see the radiator itself, the cooling fans. This is a pretty similar layout to what the Aston had stock. Been modified a little bit to put a little bit bigger radiator in. You can see the upper radiator mount and the AC condenser. And then in front of that, we have the stock power steering cooler. That's this little bumpy thing back here. And directly below that, we have the C7 Corvette charge cooler. And down below that in front, we have the oil cooler. So coming back to look at the engine, right here, we have the steam line. This comes back, picks up some factory Aston bits, and goes back to the factory Aston air separator tank. We also have this line. This runs back up here and runs into a fitting that was added at the top of the radiator. And then if we look here, this 3/4 inch line also runs from that air separator tank, and that runs to the bottom of the intercooler, or I'm sorry, bottom of the radiator. And then over here, this is the factory power steering tank, and it is in the factory location. It picks up the factory return line. And if we look down at the rack, this is also a factory line. So the only line that's been modified on the power steering is this one back here, which we showed when the engine was off the car. And then this big right here, this is the feed line for it. So those were changed slightly, but power steering's in a similar location to stock, and it allowed me to reuse most of those lines. Similarly, if we look back here at the AC condenser, we can see that these are factory lines. So the factory hard line was tweaked just a little bit to clear the radiator, and then this condenser was moved very slightly in location. And then the other line comes right up along here over. We have some sensors. I don't think those will end up getting used. I think that's going to end up getting converted to GM sensors. And then I have the wrong size. This will get converted to a different fitting. This needs to be a reduced barrier hose. This is a standard barrier, number 8 AC fitting. So I'll swap that out, but it will work just fine. So last but not least, from a plumbing perspective, we have the intercooler hoses. So these come in with the factory GM quick disconnects. So this is a fill port. I have an adapter in there to allow me to fill a little bit easier. And then we have one side comes over here. This runs down to the pump. And then the other side back here runs down to the charge cooler in the front. And then we have our tank right here. This is for filling the coolant. Actually, we'll fill from both spots. But this makes it a little bit easier to get most of the volume in here. This is actually from a Chevy Bolt cooling system, I believe, and has a few little brackets and just runs back down. The pump will go down here in the fender well on the US passenger vehicle right side, just because there's plenty of room there. And on this side, on the driver's side, down in that area, is going to be the vacuum pump for the brake booster, and then obviously the intake system. This looks tight up here, but you can actually fit a 4-inch pipe from here all the way down. So I'll have a 4-inch pipe down to a fender well intake, and I'll get that fabricated as we get a little bit further along. The next things I need to hook up from a plumbing perspective This is an air, this is the breather. This will end up running real short over to the breathers over here. And then I've got the feed and return lines from the dry sump oil pan to the dry sump tank. This is just a big Peterson tank. It looks high because of the angle there, but it does clear the hood by about an inch. So that's all fine and dandy. And then all of the hoses are clamped. They've all been tightened up and mounted so that they stay roughly where they are. Keep them nice and clear away from any spinny or hot bits. So next up, I'm gonna get those oil lines done. I've got to redo some oil lines up to the oil cooler. That's down right here underneath the grill area, grill support there. So I've got to redo one of those. I smashed one when I put the subframe in one at the time, so whoopsie daisy. But yeah, we'll get that taken care of. And then last but not least, I'm not gonna get in the car right now, just because I am filthy. But if we open it up, apparently my radar detector fell into my shifter here, but we have my shifter position. So this is where the shifter went. And if we see, it's very nice and centered in the factory location. I'll probably get everybody a seizure trying to do that with the phone in my hand. But yeah, so that's the shifter setup we've got. If we look from a height perspective, it's a little bit lower than stock, not terribly so. So I'm gonna 3D print a little adapter to use the factory boot, and this should really all look pretty stock. So like I said, I'll do another update when the oil lines are completed, and we'll show what that process looks like. Thanks all.